very fortunate today. I managed to bring a consultant in from Singapore. Actually, he was on his way to Anguilla to speak, and on his way home, we managed to bring him into St. Martin to speak about the Singapore model. I had the privilege of meeting Christopher KHOO several months ago when he did a seminar in Barbados about the Singapore model in tourism, and I was very impressed at the time about how the way that they make decisions, their data-driven decision-making, and the impact it's had on their economy, the fact that they've managed to build a tourism economy which is only 6% of their GDP and yet generates a full $20 billion for their economy. They've managed to keep a very low unemployment rate of just 2%. So clearly Singapore has done many things that are successful, and I think that bringing them here, we brought them into what I would call an expanded tripartite setting where labor unions, civil servants, and business community can listen to a presentation where he explains about the history of Singapore, where they were, how they've gotten to where they are, and some of the decisions that they've taken over time, and some of the policies, in particular regarding to social development, in particular regarding to wages, their work policies, things like that. And I believe that there's no need for St. Martin to reinvent the wheel anywhere. I think that there's lessons we can learn from other people. So for us, it's really just an eye-opener. It's here to get the creative juices flowing, to get our people in St. Martin to think about being bold, about creative, and how we can find a solution that's good for the people, learning from our neighbors.
How do you think the participation has been?
You know, I'm very happy. I think that the engagement's been wonderful. I mean, we had just the first part of the presentation so far, but the questions that are coming from the audience are showing that they're really listening, and they're really questioning and saying, my gosh, you know, how did you do that? So the great thing is they're obviously listening, they're obviously engaged, and they're asking, how did you do that? And the great thing about it is, one of the things in St. Martin is we have a tendency to say, oh, yeah, but we can never do that, or that's too hard, or we've never done things that way. So the great thing is, if you can see somebody else who's already done it that way, it certainly takes away the argument that it can't be done. It's really just a question of how to do it. And so that's what I'm really hoping, that today will sort of get those juices flowing and start that tripartite process of labor, unions, and business. Labor, business, and government working together in terms of how do we come with a win-win solution for the island.
Society is made up of morals and values. What do we mean by morals and values? Morals are also called principles. Morals are habits with respect to right or wrong conduct. Morality is ultimately a personal compass of right and wrong. Values are standards or ideals. Values are important and lasting beliefs shared by the members of a culture about what is good or bad and desirable or undesirable. Values have major influence on a person's behavior and attitude and serve as broad guidelines in all situations. One important result of morals and values is integrity. Without morals and values, there can be no integrity. The word integrity is much used in our society of late. That is understandable, because integrity is one of the main building blocks of a well-functioning democracy. Without integrity, corruption can take hold of a community. Corruption is defined by Transparency International as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. The gain can be either financial or non-financial. In a worst-case scenario, extreme corruption could lead to poverty and could be the cause of hardship. An impoverished community can quickly turn chaotic and unstable. This scenario should make it clear that the fight against corruption is necessary. More importantly, every one of us, as citizens, must take responsibility for this fight. We should all be concerned about the spread of corruption, which can be compared to a virus capable of crippling government, discrediting public institutions and private corporations, as well as having a devastating impact on the human rights of populations.
This is a picture of Singapore prior to the war. Really very simple. The British surrendered to the Japanese. This is General Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who conducted that war 2 months to take over the pride of the British Empire in the southeast into Singapore. General Percival was the guy who surrendered. Japanese atrocities, unspeakable. I personally, in my family, I know my grandmother when she was still alive, she said she lost 2 of her 5 children during the war, 2 boys. So it did affect my family. My mother was born slightly after the war, so she was number 6 in that family. But the Japanese were they were a cruel race in terms of the atrocities that were committed against the local population. Post-war deprivation, post-war recovery was a very traumatic time for Singapore. What did we have going for us? In spite of all this, up until 1965, what did we have going for us? Still our central location as a port. And it still serves its function. We still leverage of it. Our people. From very early on, we recognize that it's the people that we're going to have to depend on. We don't have oil, we don't have anything. If you don't rely on your people, the country is not going to survive. We recognize that the British ain't going to come back and save us. The Americans were certainly not in a position to do so. And unless we open our arms and ask the Chinese or the Indians, but nobody was going to come to save us if these 2.5 million people did not save themselves. We had a colonial infrastructure that we valued. If anything, I took the GCE O levels and A levels. I'm not sure if some of you take that or took that, but you would recognize that term, the O levels and the A levels. We still have the high court system, the British civil service. So we retain much of that colonial infrastructure. And I put this name down here, Dr. Albert Winsemius, because he was a World Bank economist who came in the early 60s and advised our local government. And you know what the thing is? We listened. We listened to what he had to say. We felt he was making sense. A couple of radical ideas, but we said, yes, we will follow those precepts. Later on, a couple of years later, he retired as a World Bank economist, and we invited him to be our economic advisor. As one of the early leaders of Singapore said, our backs were against the wall, and we just made space for him to join us. And Dr. Winsemius continued to be our advisor up until the time he passed away. Towards the later years, he would probably come once or twice in a year just to see the progress that Singapore had made. Today, okay, now in 1965, Singapore's per capita GDP, in other words, equivalent of what one average Singaporean generated, we were generating about $500 per person in 1965. This year, I just read the statistics, per capita GDP stands at $56,000. It's currently ranked at 7th in the world, just slightly ahead of the US. A couple of countries ahead of us are those like Qatar and Bahrain, where they rely on a lot of oil. Singapore has some of the highest life expectancy in the world, in Asia, and that actually is a testimony to the medical facilities, the standard of health care, and a child that is born in Singapore can expect to have benefit from one of the best education systems in the world. Home ownership is high, currently at just under 90%. How did we get from there, where we were in 1965, to where we are today? I'm not showing you pictures of Singapore right now because sometimes people say, we'll never be able to achieve what you've achieved. These are some benchmarks. I just took this off the website of our Economic Development Board. Even today, they are out there hustling, knocking on doors, talking to CEOs and companies, saying, come, invest in Singapore. We are very fixated on growth, on the economy, and these are some of the benchmarks they like to trot out to say, number 1 city, best city investment potential and competitiveness and legislation, government, number 3 in the world for least corruption, most transparent country, and some of these other benchmarks. What were the fundamental principles that guided Singapore throughout these years. Singapore, since, I don't know, 1990, has become a much studied case study. People were saying, what made it tick? How come you're so successful? And there were lots of different papers, academic papers, written about why Singapore became so successful. I'm not adding anything. I'm using the framework which is given by the Dean of the Singapore School of Public Policy, Kishore Mahbubani, and he likes to explain it using these three terms, MPH, so miles per hour, or to talk about the speed of Singapore's development. He attributed it to three fundamental principles that are actually part of Singapore's DNA now. Meritocracy. Best man for the best job. Do it based on capability. That has been a fundamental principle in Singapore since the earliest beginning. Didn't matter whether you were born in the right family, with the right skin tone, whether you went to the right schools. It was the best man for the best job. Our early cabinet consisted of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Cambridge-trained lawyer, probably the only, what was that title? Double distinction in law. The only person who topped him in terms of getting that degree was his wife. The only person who managed a double first was about 30 years later in mathematics, was his son. Brilliant chap, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. His cabinet comprised people who were born in Malaya, Sri Lanka, locally born, Caucasians, British nationals, all part of his cabinet. It's when we look back now and look at it, the composition of that cabinet, it was quite astounding. He had assembled around him some of the best brains, some of the most capable minds of idealists who penned things like regardless of race, language, or religion. You know, and that still drives a lot of our of what we are. Mr. Rajaratnam, the first foreign minister, he actually said Singapore is not you're a Singaporean not because of where you're born, you're a Singaporean by conviction. This idea of, regardless of race, language, or religion. Meritocracy was very, very embedded in Singapore. Best man for the best job, even to today. Scholarships were given out. I know I was in a class, we were all competing, and scholarships were always given out to, if it's the top 5, the top 5 would get it. And you would be recognized that way. There was no such thing as, he's from the Malay community, we need to give him something so that he looks good, or that community looks good. Not going to happen in Singapore. Pragmatism. Singapore is a very non-ideological country. We would embrace ideas if they work, regardless of whether they were Western, communist, socialist, whether it was promoted by somebody else. So long as something worked, a policy worked, we would say, can we do that in Singapore? Can we adapt it? Let's do it. If I had time and I could run through with you different aspects of Singapore's policy making, you'd find that we had adopted ideas from China, from Sweden, from the US, from the Brits, really without any baggage that we would say, we don't want, because they're our past colonial masters. Dr. Goh Keng Swee, our economic czar, that's the modern term people use, he was quoted in one of the memoirs. He said to one of his junior civil servants, they were facing a problem, and he said, there's any problem that Singapore is facing, all right, somebody else has already solved it. we're not so unique in the world that we are facing a unique problem. It's that somebody else has already solved it in the world. Go and find it, adapt it to our local conditions, and then implement it. I remember going on many different trips when I was a junior officer in the Singapore Tourism Board, and we would go out to Dubai, we would go out to London, and we would be learning. We'd go out to San Antonio and look at the river walk and say, can we do something like this? And then we brought back and did something like that for Singapore River. We would look at different ideas all over the world and just say, can we adopt that to Singapore? This pragmatism idea is saying, I'm not so proud that I can't learn from somebody else. I remember that Singapore took one of the first ideas from London about a Christmas light up. They would light up the streets, one of the streets in London for Christmas. And then we kind of took that idea and made a big hoo-ha about that, lighting up the whole Orchard Road. And we had those people coming back, studying us and doing a better job, and we went to study them again, even though they studied from us. The same with the Singapore Shopping Festival. We created a Singapore Shopping Festival visit. We said shopping was one of our strengths, so we needed to have a festival to focus a lot of energy and marketing effort into that. And the Great Singapore Sale was a 1-month-long event. Very successful. Dubai came, learnt, came up with a better execution. 3 years later, we went to Dubai to learn what they were doing so that we could learn from them. So there was really no, my idea was first, and so I'm better than you. We'd always be looking at very pragmatic people. And finally, honesty. Honesty, because we had the early bunch of leaders were idealist. They were driven by what can we do for Singapore in terms of being corruption-free. They recognized back then, one of the early campaign, when they were in the opposition, they said, we wanted to stamp out corruption in the system. And they stood for clean government. And since then, one of their hallmarks is they were always wearing white. White shirt, white pants, the People's Action Party. But honesty extended from the top down, not something imposed to just all the workers, top down. One of the early stories about honesty, we had probably equivalent of a junior minister shortly after the first cabinet took over. And he went out, he and his friend, their families, close families, went on a holiday. The guy said, I can't pay for the holiday right now. So his friend said, it's okay, I'll front it to you. I'll pay for the trip, our families will go. When he came back, he was arrested, maybe not arrested, interrogated as to why there was this impression of wrongdoing. I wasn't so sure if he really took money for a bribe or for favors, but it gave the impression that there was something going on there. He eventually resigned, and we've had ministers, civil servants from the highest levels resign for the impression of impropriety. In Singapore today, if ever you get stopped by a traffic police for whatever infraction, do not put $10 or $50 to give him when you're handing over your driver's license, because that would guarantee you end up in jail. The culture of incorruptibility extended from I'm not saying Singapore is perfect. There are people I'm sure would have accepted something like that. But it came from the top. Read about it. I don't want to belabor this point, but this is just 3 of the, what I call defining fundamental principles that still pervade Singapore society today. Emil mentioned that term, a siege mentality. Since 1965, we've always been said, if we don't succeed Nobody's going to come to save us. I was in Anguilla last week. I had a seminar with about 80 of their tourism people and some policy makers. And I said, maybe provocatively, I said, you've had 7 years of government wage freeze. The economy looks like it's tanking. Nobody seems to be getting excited. There's no sense of urgency. Is that because you've got the UK ready to come and save you? And they all say, no. Is the US ready to come and save you? No, who's going to save you? And then they realize it was themselves. And I look at this and I say, Singapore had always come to that realization that we had to rely on ourselves in everything. The British showed their colors. We're still great buddies with them, but they showed their colors when the country fell, when they pulled out their bases. The Americans call on us regularly, but we know that at the end of the day, we're still a small pawn in this big game. And we have to rely on us. It's a siege mentality. Since the 1965, it's if the country doesn't prosper, we're not going to get a job. Nobody's going to. There is no such thing as a free lunch for us. And it's excel or die. Always knowing that if we don't excel, we would be quickly overtaken by our neighbors. That sets the stage for Singapore as a country. And I've just got 3, maybe 4 slides to talk about Singapore as a tourism destination, to give you an example of how one sector is performing. As I said, Singapore is small, 700 square kilometers, nothing there to see, nothing to do, no beaches, no mountains, no views, no domestic market, no culture that people can point to and say, you know, we've got this great cuisine, or we've got this great people with a great heritage. We were all immigrants, right? Migrants, probably the third son or whatever who left the farm to seek his fortune. Not the first, not the second, but the third son, and he would sail out to the South China Sea, find his fortune in Singapore. We don't even have a dedicated tourism ministry or a minister. The tourism board is subsumed under the Ministry of Trade and Industry, right? However, this is how Singapore's tourism has performed in the last 40 years. Since the time data was collected, first thing you notice is it's generally an upward trend. Yes, we've had certain periods where there was slowdown or even negative. The world recession, this is when I joined the tourism industry. In Singapore, in Southeast Asia, there was this Asian financial crisis that hit us. How many of you remember SARS? It was a very terrible time. In Singapore, I think, had the most fatalities in the world. And that affected our tourism drastically. We call it the Lehman Brothers collapse. I think there's a different name for this financial crisis in 2008, 2009 here. What strikes me about tourism is every time there is a major crisis, we recover, right? We will scramble, come up with new strategies, and recover. And it tells me tourism, at least for Singapore, is very resilient. We'll always continue to recover after whatever knocks that the world economy can inflict on us. This is where it came all the way to 2015. 2014 was the peak at about 15.6 million. There was a slight drop in 2014. 2013 was the peak. 2014, slight drop to 15.1 million. What is 15.6 million arrivals in a year? That's 1.4 million arrivals every month into Singapore. This is what we track. We've got up until 2013, 15.6 arrivals. But this is not the number that excites us. We don't get excited about this number. We are tracking this number. This number is tourism receipts. In Singapore, sure, we do track headcount. And that's the easiest. You know, oh, we've got more people this year than last year. That's the easiest. But we track how much they spend in Singapore, because that's the thing that's going to make a difference to our economy. How much they leave in the country, how much they spend in Singapore. $23.5 billion. That's about 20 billion US. Slightly less, probably. All right? And this is tourism receipts. We track it, we understand it, we dissect it, and we know what sells and what doesn't sell in Singapore. These are almost every country can share this with you, the top 15 countries that make up your population. Here, China, 1.7 million. The year before that, they were about 2.3 million. There was, I think, about a 30 or 40% drop in Chinese arrivals. We managed to absorb that because we are very diversified. But if ever you have to face a 40% drop of your second largest market, you know it's how important it is to be diversified. Tourism receipts, we know where they spend the money. All right? 20% of this 23 billion is spent on shopping. 23%, almost a quarter, is spent on accommodation, food and beverage, sightseeing, and others. And this gives you an idea, aha, so this is where they're spending the money on. And it helps you do your tourism planning, your policy planning. Not only do we know where they're spending the money on, we can also drill down and understand which markets are spending on what. And sometimes some people would say, this is just colors. But I think I can draw out a lot of policy decisions that come out of this.